So I'm Michael Commons. I've been working with EarthNet Foundation now for about 18 years and living in Thailand a little bit longer than that. I had the chance to interview some farmers from Green Net. I've been working recently to check in on them, and I'm telling you a little about there. I'm taking the chance to show you I practice agroforestry with my wife and family here. So the background here, you'll see some of the agroforestry shots. We are students of Puyai Wibun Kemchalaram, who was the president of EarthNet Foundation until he passed away a little more than 2 years ago. And yeah, so that's, I also, in Green Net, we say we should practice the organic way of life. We're not just trying to support fair trade and organic, but trying to live it as well.
ฉันชื่อนางกนิษฐาจันไดอยู่บ้านศรีฐานตอนนี้คืออยู่ศูนย์พันธุ์เป็นศูนย์เกษตรอินทรีย์ของตำบลศรีฐานจังหวัดยโสธร
ค่ะดิฉันชื่อนางนงคารจันเหลืองค่ะก็เป็นสมาชิกของพันเหมือนกันค่ะก็นาก็อยู่แถวๆนี้แหละค่ะใกล้ๆกันนี่แหละค่ะ
ค่ะถ้าจะถามว่าข้าวมันมีความสำคัญไหมถ้าชีวิตคนอีสานคือชีวิตของคนไทยข้าวมันจะมาในอันดับหนึ่งเลยข้าวนี่มีความสำคัญต่อชีวิตของคนเรามากกับทุกอย่างเพราะว่าเรากินข้าวเป็นหลักอันนี้คือมันข้าวนี้จะส่วนใหญ่ทางภาคอีสานจะเป็นกินข้าวเหนียวแต่ก็กินผสมผสานกับข้าวหอมมะลิข้าวมะลิก็เป็นข้าวหลักแต่ทั้งเป็นข้าวทั้งเศรษฐกิจแล้วก็เป็นอาหารที่เรากินเป็นประจำอยู่แล้วแต่ถ้าเราทำเยอะเราก็จะมาแปรรูปข้าวสำหรับชีวิตคนอีสานข้าวก็คือชีวิตเอกก็ว่าได้สิ่งที่สำคัญที่สุดก็คือข้าวมาก่อนอย่างอื่นไม่มาก็ตามขอให้มีข้าวคนอีสานอยู่ได้แล้วก็รายได้ส่วนใหญ่เขาจะมาจากข้าวกันค่ะคือตอนฉากที่แล้วจะเป็นตอนที่ข้าวที่อยู่ในนาลุ่มคือเราดึงน้ำจากแม่น้ำจากหนองหรือสระขึ้นมาใส่สีมันจะเขียวสวยแต่ตอนนี้เราประสบปัญหาโลกร้อนคือจะมีตัวนี้เพิ่มขึ้นมาก็คือหญ้าตัวนี้มันจะเกิดขึ้นกับนาข้าวที่เป็นแปลงนี้นี่คือหญ้ากับข้าวแต่ช่วงนี้คือข้าวขาดน้ำมาเป็น 3-4 เดือนแล้วเพิ่งมาเจอวันนี้น้ำแต่ถ้าฝนไม่มาอีกเราก็จะไม่มีข้าวเราจะมีแต่ดอกหญ้าแต่ปกติแล้วปีที่ผ่านมาเราก็คิดว่ามีฝนอยู่แต่เราก็เจอประสบปัญหาคือทุกปีเราจะได้ข้าวประมาณ 17-18 ตันแต่ปีที่แล้วเราได้แค่7 ตันแต่เป็นปีนี้เราหวังแค่3 ตันไม่รู้ว่าจะได้ไหม เพราะว่าปัญหาโลกร้อน
So the most surprising thing for me in my visit was really to see the dramatic impact of climate change and the unusual weather and what that was doing to nature as well. This was clear in my discussion from the first day, and I talked with Paul Munn and with Chutima, and Paul Munn said that the rains, that basically the frogs did not croak until September in the prior year. The normal rainy season in Thailand starts in May. Maybe it starts in June, it's a little bit later. But the frogs, in order to come out, and it's not only the frogs, it's also the fish, they need a heavy rain. They need a rain that fills the ponds and fills the rice fields. And unlike in Europe, where maybe there's animals that would rest through the winter, in Thailand, the fish and the frogs, they hibernate by burying themselves deep in mud during the dry season, which would be maybe from December until April. And then when the heavy rains come, they emerge and they spread out, they lay eggs, and they grow. The young fish and the young frogs would grow. But because this season was so much faster, what we were seeing, as Paul Munn says, is you have the biggest predatory fish, the snakehead fish, which can easily get this big and get over a foot. For certain, they're only 2 to 3 inches. So they were reaching full maturity, but at a small size. The same was true with frogs. Fully mature frogs that should be bigger than my hand would be about this big, it was showing me. And they had only a few months, well, not even a few months, I guess it was September, October, and November to grow, and then they had to already, prepare themselves for hibernation. So that was the negative side, which was kind of shocking. On the positive side, which I always find is the new ways that the farmers have figured out how to do better and how to adapt. And in this case, one method that I had never seen before in Thailand, but I knew of from Tamil Nadu, which is an area that has much more stress in uncertain monsoons, was the use of what's called relay cropping. Matao, Tao, and Ganita, I saw them both using relay cropping, where they planted the rice, but together with the rice, they planted some other crops, including mung beans. And basically the time that I visited, it was still really dry. So the mung beans were doing sufficiently better than the rice. Mung beans need less water, but they're planting them in the rice field. In this case, she said, well, if it's really dry, we get a harvest of mung beans. And she had a couple other things in there as well. It wasn't only mung beans. But when the rains come, if they do, hopefully, then those plants will break down and they will be fertilizer. The beans themselves are leguminous, so they provide nitrogen. And at the same time, they also help to a degree suppress the weeds, because rice is adapted to living in flooded conditions. And when we have flooding or periodic flooding, then the rice will outgrow almost all of the weeds. But when it's dry or the soil's just moist, the weeds grow much faster. So this was really cool to see this working and as one of the adaptations.
ค่ะคือตอนนี้เราก็ประสบปัญหาเกี่ยวกับโลกร้อนถ้าถามว่าเราจะปรับตัวเข้ากับปัญหาโลกร้อนได้ไหมเราก็คิดว่าน่าจะได้ก็คือทางกลุ่มเราตอนนี้ก็รณรงค์ให้ทุกคนในกลุ่มปลูกต้นไม้เพิ่มปีละ 20-30 ต้นก็ยังดีเพื่อจะช่วยให้มีต้นไม้มากขึ้นช่วยให้โลกมีออกซิเจนมากขึ้นค่ะแล้วก็เราจะแก้ปัญหาจากการที่เราไม่ได้เข้ากับภาวะโลกร้อนนี้คือฤดูแล้งเราจะชวนให้ลูกกลุ่มทุกคนปลูกพืชฤดูแล้งปลูกพืชที่เราจะใช้น้ำน้อยที่สุดใช้พลังงานไฟฟ้าน้อยที่สุดแต่เราจะดึงพลังงานแสงอาทิตย์มาใช้แทนทดแทนเพื่อเราจะปรับตัวให้เข้ากับภาวะโลกร้อนค่ะก่อนอื่นนะคะคือตอนแรกเรายังไม่รู้เกษตรอินทรีย์แต่เราอยากจะศึกษาว่าเกษตรอินทรีย์เป็นอย่างไรเราก็เลยเริ่มต้นมาทำเกษตรอินทรีย์ทำเกษตรอินทรีย์แล้วรู้ว่ามันทำให้ลดโลกร้อนได้บ้างช่วยคนทั้งโลกได้กินอาหารที่ปลอดภัยแล้วก็คือมันช่วยให้เรามีอยู่มีกินมีอยู่อย่างพอเพียงคือมีทุกอย่างแต่เราก็ทำเป็นข้าวเป็นหลักแต่งานที่เสริมต่อมาก็คือเป็นพืชผสมผสานในฤดูแล้งเพื่อจะลดโลกร้อนในการคือภาคฤดูแล้งนี่เราจะปลูกพืชที่ไม่ใช้น้ำเท่าไหร่เป็นรายได้เสริมจากการทำนา
So with Green Net, this has been a reality for the farmers in our network for a long time, and Green Net actually was one of the first organizations to really look at this and be aware of that. So we had a program to look at that with other organizations and to develop resiliency. And the major focus on resiliency was in water. For farming, water is the most critical resource. Without water, we can't grow anything. With water, even with poor soil or what else, we still have a chance to grow something. And in that study, I remember well that already from meteorological data and the projections, that basically have more irregularity of rains, more possibility of dry spells, delay of rains. At the same time, when it rains, it's more likely to rain with greater intensity, and so more likely of flooding. With that project, which is more than 10 years ago, that's I think it's about 12 or 14 years ago that we started that, a lot of money was invested, and farmers could borrow money to at very low interest rate to invest in their own water management. So included digging ponds, maybe digging wells, better, more efficient use of lawns. And also was another focus along with that was diversification. So there was a look at all the different crops that are normally eaten in farmer families and to try to produce basically all the normal vegetables and herbs and so forth and fruits that you would have, that you would be consuming in your family. And I think this all really worked well. I mean, in fact, it was very impressive, and there was a lot of experimentation, even making interesting windmills, and it did make different systems that were much more efficient in terms of their use of water. But what's happened, which was highly apparent in my visit just recently and talking to all the farmers, is that climate change has changed faster than these resiliency measures have been able to deal with. Basically, it's been, well, this year is more wet, I can say. It's not a really wet year. It's still there's having problems, but since I'm there, there's been more rain. But there were two of the driest years we have had. I mean, in my own area, it's the driest years that anyone can remember, where basically in the rainy season there's much water. And being there, you can see that already these big ponds or reservoirs that were dug were dried up. So even though normally we should have heavy rains in part of the rainy season, and that could fill a reservoir, which would give us elasticity. But if you don't capture the water when it rains, then you have no water to work with when it's dry. That can also help to prevent the intensity of flooding. Of course, there's other really good benefits in terms of improving the soil. With the good soil, it acts like a sponge. It absorbs a lot more water. It holds a lot more water. Plants have more health and vitality. We also did a lot of experimentation of different methods. And what I saw this time was actually having to be even more creative in terms of water use. So they all raised the issue that they'd seen in the last couple of years. The rains had come so late that the rice as well as the fish and the frogs didn't have enough time to really grow fully. Thai jasmine rice is light sensitive. It will flower in October and it will be ready to harvest around mid-November. It doesn't matter how long it starts growing, it goes through that process. There are other rice varieties that will be 120 days from planting until harvest, or a certain amount of time, but light sensitive varieties are like this. Normally there should be sufficient rain for the planting season by June at the latest. It can start in June, maybe July, but really never later than that. The rainy season should start in May, but by maybe you're going to do planting. But they were having that the rains weren't really arriving until August. So then maybe there's only a month and a half for the plants to grow before they start flowering, and finding that this did not allow for the grains to be fully healthy. So farmers here wanting to have fully grain, they have to irrigate. Basically, they were irrigating their fields either with bore wells or a little bit of remaining water in the deep wells, and then trying to use this very efficiently. So one farmer that I visited, he was basically watering just to keep the soil moist. Rice can live well in flooded conditions, and when it's flooded it controls the weeds because most other plants can't, but it doesn't need to be flooded. It just needs to have the soil moist. They also have diversity going on, and definitely that's was the big consideration now as looking forward, because with these 2 years and such low water, and also they have fields at different levels, some that are lower, like more in a valley, and some that are higher up. When there's limited water, they may only produce on half the fields that are most lowest, and not on the higher fields. But typically, as the rains come, they would be able to plant the higher fields. But in these past years, they haven't been able to plant them, so there's the thought, well, maybe we shouldn't even try to grow rice. Let's grow something that is much less water intensive. These could be other crops. One of them was sesame. It could be agroforestry, which would have a whole lot more resilience. So they're looking at this. So now we have already an impressive change in terms of diversity, in terms of water management. But with the extremes of climate change, this is not enough anymore. And maybe the reality is that maybe we can't depend upon the rains enough to produce a full rice crop. So the new thought is we should take some of the lands that are more drier, the higher lands that we were higher rice fields that were going on, and convert to other crops that don't require that much water at all. If they're tree crops, then they would have a whole lot more resilience, even if it doesn't rain. And aside from that, investing even more in irrigation with bore wells, which is getting deep fossil water. You get water even when it's dry. The only issue, well, not the only issue, a big issue with bore wells though is they are really taking fossil reservoirs of water. So they really should be used very cautiously. I saw myself in Tamil Nadu in India where there was extensive bore wells and the water table was extremely low, like more than 100 meters deep now because of so many bore wells. I don't think that's a situation we want to be getting into.
ที่กลัวที่สุดคือกลัวต้นไม้จะหมดจากโลกและก็กลัวว่าภาวะโลกร้อนมันจะเกิดไม่ว่าจะเป็นน้ำท่วมหรือภัยแล้งอย่างรุนแรงเรากลัวที่มันจะมาแบบรุนแรงถ้าว่าจะให้กลัวเกี่ยวกับการเมืองนั้นก็กลัวอยู่แต่ว่ามันไกลตัวเราเป็นเกษตรกรแล้วก็ต้องกลัวภัยธรรมชาติมากกว่าค่ะสิ่งที่กังวลก็คือภัยธรรมชาติกับกลัวต้นไม้จะหมดจากโลกสิ่งที่กลัวมากที่สุด
ก็ฝันอยากจะมีป่าเหมือนสมัย30 กว่าปีก่อนนี่ค่ะไปเก็บเห็ดเก็บอะไรได้เหมือนเดิมอยากให้ป่ากลับมาค่ะ
How did COVID affect the farmers and maybe how it was changing their thoughts? I guess what was initially very surprising, and Ms. Kristina Williams says that they didn't have any registered cases of COVID-19 in Yasotorn. So they're very lucky in this regard. And then most of the farmers who I spoke with really are doing very well in compared to, I think, almost anyone. Green Net had more demand. They were basically working non-stop. They didn't have a high risk, so they were essential for food production. And farmers, the demand for organic food seemed to be more than before. People need food, and they also had a lot of self-reliance. Basically, almost all of the farmers, the organic farmers in Green Net in Yasotorn, they produce their rice, they have vegetables, they might have eggs, they might have fish. So they're not so dependent upon the monetary economy. They did all experience the same things that most of us experience around the world, that you couldn't go out, you couldn't go to the same places, and for some of the markets where people meet up, because there are farmers markets, some of them were not functioning normally, so they couldn't go there. And then another case this was maybe the other more profound side, was how it affected their relatives and people they knew, because so many people from the northeast of Thailand or any of the rural areas in Thailand, they go to work in factories or they work in the city, and in the city and the factories and particularly the hotel and tourism industry stopped. So now relatives who have their homes from these villages would be out of work, and maybe for a long time, and still out of work, to be honest, today if it's the tourism industry. In some cases, some of these relatives came back and maybe they could join in farming activities. But it was also pointed out, when this really only works if the people coming back have some knowledge and skill in farming, and for the organic farmers, or basically most farmers are not producing a lot aside from maybe just rice or one product. But if there are farmers with a diversity of crops, a diversity of incomes, maybe local processing, then they can welcome more relatives to help out. They can do more work, they can make more earnings, but this is not the norm. And then probably the most severe problem is so many farmers in Thailand, and I think around the world, the farmers are the elderly now, and they are normally going to be 60 to 70 years old. They are normally taking care of the grandchildren. Their children typically are working in the city or in factories, and they're sending money home. But now with COVID, many of them lost their jobs or lost their income. So farmers who are dependent upon income coming from their children working outside were not getting this income. So this was a major factor, and I think it's a factor throughout the world.
ค่ะสำหรับโควิด -19 นะคะเราก็ตามชนบทของเรา กลุ่มเกษตรอินทรีย์ของเรานี่จะไม่มีปัญหาค่ะเพราะว่าเรามีข้าวอยู่ในหม้อมีอาหารอยู่ตามทุ่งนาเราก็สามารถอยู่ได้ถ้าเกิดตลาดปิดเราก็สามารถดำรงชีพอยู่ได้ตามปกติแต่ถ้าสำหรับคนในเมืองถ้าตลาดปิดข้าวก็ไม่มีกินแล้วก็จะทำไงล่ะมาตลาดก็ไม่มีอะไรที่จะขายแต่เรามีถ้าตลาดปิดปุ๊บเรามาที่นาเราก็มีอาหารมีปลามีผักอะไรเราก็สามารถอยู่ได้ค่ะ
As far as women, I don't think I may be the best person to be speaking because I'm not a woman myself, so I can't say I've experienced all. But as far as my involvement in Green Net, I think it's quite special and interesting that since before I was there, we've had a manager for Green Net Cooperative, Ms. Bunjera, who's a woman. And then in the farmer rice mills, most of them have been managed by women, as is currently with Jutima as the manager of the Nature Care Club Community Rice Mill, and the manager of our rice packing plant and quality and the project there, Ms. Krisana Wilaiwan, is also a woman. Many women in Thai society and the women I met, they take a leading role. I feel in terms of in basically how we work and when we do training and extension, it's very easy to have women join. Some groups there's actually more women joining than the men because they say women may be doing more of the farming activity, maybe men are seeking working outside. Not always, there may be more men joining, but you always have a lot of both women and men. This is not the same necessarily in other countries. My experience doing training sessions and projects where we have participants from around South and Southeast Asia, it's a little bit more difficult to get women participants from India and Indonesia comparatively. Of course, there are excellent participants who are women, but it's maybe culturally a little bit different. But something that is different, I guess, if we compare particularly with the northern European countries like Sweden and Scandinavia, in Thailand, women still do much more of the home and family work than men on average. It's not 50%. Normally, it's depending upon obviously the relationship in the family. Men tend to do a lot less of the cooking and cleaning and taking care of the kids. I think an important part, which is the case with me and my wife, is I'm living in my wife's home on her land, and this is quite typical. So women inherit land, and it's often that the husband will come in and marry into the family, and I think in this case women are in a very strong position because I'm on her land and with her family and so forth, where sometimes you hear of stories that are not as good about brides marrying into the husband's family and maybe not being so well taken care of.
ค่ะถ้าทำไมเราต้องเป็นสมาชิกใช่ไหมคะคือถ้าเราอยู่คนเดียวเราก็ไม่รู้โลกกว้างถ้าเราจับกลุ่มกันทำอะไรมันก็จะสำเร็จได้ง่ายเพราะในเมื่อเรามีกลุ่มมีสมาชิกเราก็รวมตัวกันขายก็ได้ราคาดีสามารถตั้งราคาเองได้ในอีกกรณีหนึ่งคือรวมกลุ่มสามัคคีกันในการทำงานถ้าเราเป็นกลุ่มเป็นก้อนเราก็ทำมันกันได้แลกเปลี่ยนกันได้คือคนหนึ่งมีความรู้ข้าวเกี่ยวกับการหยอดคนหนึ่งมีความรู้ข้าวเกี่ยวกับการปักดำแล้วเรามาแลกเปลี่ยนกันในกลุ่มมันถึงเป็นเราถึงเริ่มต้นตั้งกลุ่มขึ้นมาเพื่อแลกเปลี่ยนความรู้กันสำหรับความยุติธรรมในการทำเกษตรแต่ถ้าเป็นในรูปของทำนาเพื่อระบบเศรษฐกิจอาจจะไม่เป็นธรรมเนื่องจากว่าอาจจะมีพ่อค้าคนกลางหรืออะไรมากดเราทำให้เราเสียเปรียบแต่ในเมื่อเราเป็นกลุ่มกันรู้สึกว่าเราเป็นธรรมมากเราสามารถตั้งราคาได้แต่ถ้ามองอีกในแง่หนึ่งเราภูมิใจที่เป็นเกษตรกรคือเรานี่สามารถทำอาหารที่ปลอดภัยแล้วก็เป็นเกษตรอินทรีย์ให้ชาวโลกได้กินแม้ว่าเราจะประสบปัญหาเกี่ยวกับภัยแล้งน้ำท่วมหรือว่าระบบเศรษฐกิจกดดันจากทางรัฐบาลแต่เราก็ภูมิใจในเรื่องของการเป็นธรรมคือเราช่วยให้โลกได้กินอาหารจากเราทำค่ะก็ก่อนอื่นต้องขอบคุณนะคะสำหรับผู้บริโภคข้าวมะลิของเราแต่ก็คือ เราอยากจะบอกว่าเราทำยากลำบากมากสำหรับเกษตรอินทรีย์เกษตรอินทรีย์นี้มันเป็นแบบเป็นเกษตรที่ต้องทำด้วยใจจริงๆด้วยความรักธรรมชาติจริงๆถึงทำได้เพราะว่าถ้าเราไม่ทำเกษตรอินทรีย์ก็ดังแปลงที่สองแปลงที่สองหมายถึงว่าแปลงที่สองนั้นคือเกษตรอินทรีย์จะเป็นในรูปแบบนั้นคือมีหญ้าเยอะแต่ถ้าเกษตรเคมีแล้วจะไม่มีหญ้าข้าวเขาจะสวยจะงามกว่าเราคือมันจะทำง่ายกว่ากันแต่มันต้องใช้ความอุตสาหะมากในการเราในความมันมีความลำบากมากในการทำเกษตรอินทรีย์มันเป็นข้าวที่ทำยากแต่เป็นข้าวที่มีความหอมหวานในตัวคือมันไม่มีสารเคมีมันจะมีรสชาติดีมากแต่ก็อยากขอบคุณทุกท่านค่ะที่กินข้าวเกษตรอินทรีย์เราคือเป็นข้าวที่เราทำด้วยใจตัวนี้ค่ะ
When I talk about the wisdom of the farmers, I think in today's world we have far too much knowledge and we give far too much recognition and importance to scientific and academic knowledge in comparison to wisdom. Wisdom for me is about relationship and experience. You can't get wisdom from reading a book. You get it from doing things, from living with the land, living in relationship to the soil, to the plants, experiencing things over the year, and learning what works and what doesn't work, learning these aspects. In Thailand, I feel very fortunate to have had the chance to learn from farmers like the farmers I've just visited, all of whom share a lot of wisdom. They have real experience and they also have the wisdom that's passed down to them from their generations before them. So it's not only what we learn in our own lifetimes, but it is definitely lifetimes of really living with the soil, with the land, but also what we inherit from prior generations.